the dollar bill in your wallet, the diploma on your parents' wall, the deed to the house you grew up in, the book that changed how you see the world, the ballot that decided an election, the map that led explorers across oceans they didn't understand. Every one of them depended on something so ordinary that you probably threw a piece of it away this morning without thinking twice. Paper, not gold, not oil, not even language itself really, because language needs somewhere to live if it's going to outlast the person speaking it. For most of human history, it had nowhere to go. A word was spoken, and then it was gone. Knowledge died with the person who carried it. Entire lifetimes of understanding simply evaporated because there was no way to make them stay. Then, somewhere in a workshop in ancient China, someone figured out how to trap thought on a sheet thinner than skin. And once that happened, civilizations stopped forgetting. But to understand how strange and hard-won that moment really was, you have to feel how badly humanity needed it. For thousands of years, we tried everything else first. And every single attempt, eventually, failed. Picture a cave in southern France, 30,000 years ago. Torchlight flickering across stone. Someone presses ochre against their palm and blows red pigment across it, leaving a handprint still visible today. It worked, in its way. But try folding that wall, try mailing it. Stone remembers everything and carries nothing. So people tried something smaller, bone. Ancient hunters scratched notches into antlers and ribs to track the moon, to count, to remember. It's beautiful. It's also nearly useless the moment you need more than a tally. You cannot write a treaty on a shin bone. Around 3400 BC, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, someone pressed a reed into wet clay and discovered something better. Wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform. Bake it hard in the sun, and the clay remembers your exact words for 5,000 years. Entire libraries of these tablets have survived into the present day, which tells you everything about their durability. Here's the catch nobody put in the sales pitch. Clay is heavy. A single tablet can weigh more than a hardcover book, and a shelf of them requires something closer to a warehouse than a bookcase. Load a camel with a library of clay tablets, and you'll understand very quickly why no empire ever built its mail system out of baked mud. Egypt found something lighter. Reeds along the Nile, sliced thin, laid crosswise, pressed and dried into sheets you could actually roll. Papyrus built the Library of Alexandria, the single greatest archive the ancient world ever assembled. But papyrus had a secret weakness. Take it out of Egypt's dry heat, into a damp European monastery, and within a few decades it doesn't preserve history. It becomes dust, and papyrus only grew well along one river. Control the Nile, or don't control your own memory at all. On the other side of the world, China tried bamboo. Imagine an imperial clerk in his office, buried to the elbows in split bamboo slats bound together with cord, each one carved with brushstrokes running top to bottom. A single routine tax report could require so many strips that 2 servants had to carry it between them like a stretcher. Officials reportedly reviewed so much bamboo correspondence in a single day that carts, not scrolls, delivered the emperor's mail. Oddly enough, 2,000 years later, the single largest use of paper on Earth wouldn't be government records or books at all. It would be cardboard, folded into boxes, and left on doorsteps by delivery drivers. But we'll get there. Silk solved almost everything bamboo couldn't. Light, smooth. It drank ink beautifully. There was just one problem. Writing on silk was like wrapping your lunch in currency. Only the wealthiest scholars could justify it, which meant that for nearly everyone else in China, silk simply didn't exist as an option. In Europe and the Middle East, animal skin offered a different answer. Stretch it, scrape it, cure it just right, and you get parchment, or its finer cousin vellum, made from the skin of a calf too young to have lived a full season. Parchment could survive for centuries. Some of it still has. But a single complete Bible could require the hides of more than 200 animals. Books, quite literally, cost livestock. A single one could be worth as much as a house, and inside many medieval libraries, the books that survived were the ones chained to their shelves, too valuable to risk anyone walking off with them. Desperate monks even found a way to cheat the shortage. When new parchment ran too scarce, they scraped the ink off older manuscripts and wrote new text over the ghost of what used to be there. Historians call these erased and reused pages palimpsests. Somewhere in Europe, lost philosophy and lost poetry is still sitting there, scraped away to make room for someone else's sermon. And then there was wax. A wooden tablet coated in a thin, dark layer, scratched with a stylus. Smooth flat again the moment you didn't need it anymore. Perfect for a shopping list. Useless for anything you actually wanted history to remember, because the moment you smoothed it over, it was gone. Stone remembered, but never moved. Bone moved, but never held enough. Clay was tough, but crushing to carry. Papyrus was light but fragile the moment it left home. Bamboo was cheap but absurdly bulky. Silk was flawless and unaffordable. Parchment was strong but paid for in livestock. Wax was endlessly reusable, which is another way of saying it forgot everything on command. Thousands of years. Nearly every material on Earth. And still, nobody had found something light, cheap, durable, and easy to produce all at once. Something had to give. It gave in China, inside a workshop that most textbooks compress into a single sentence, which badly undersells what actually happened there. By the Han Dynasty, China had built one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies the world had ever seen. Taxes recorded, land surveyed, law distributed across provinces thousands of miles from the capital. An empire that size runs on paperwork, except there was no paper yet, only bamboo bundles too heavy to lift and silk too expensive to waste, and neither one could keep pace with an empire that size. Somewhere inside that overworked bureaucracy sat a court official named Kai Lun, around 105 AD, watching the problem pile up in front of him. And here's the detail most retellings skip. Kai Lun almost certainly didn't invent papermaking from nothing. Archaeologists have found fragments of paper-like material in Chinese tombs older than his lifetime. What Kai Lun did was arguably harder. He took a rough, inconsistent process and turned it into something an empire could actually run on. Picture the workshop itself. The air smells of wet bark and river water. Wooden mallets rise and fall against soaked fiber for hours, until tree bark, old rags, discarded fishing nets, and mulberry bark collapse into a cloudy grey soup. A craftsman lowers a fine bamboo screen into the vat and lifts it out slowly, and for one suspended second, where there was only muddy water, a pale, fragile sheet clings to the mesh. Press it, peel it, lay it in the sun. What dries in the afternoon light is a thin, flexible sheet made almost entirely out of things people were already throwing away. Sit with that for a moment. The invention that would eventually carry the weights of nearly every civilization on Earth was built out of garbage. Old nets, worn-out rags, bark nobody wanted. Now put it next to everything that came before it, and the gap becomes almost unfair. That imperial clerk who needed 2 servants to carry a single tax report. An apprentice could now tuck the same information under one arm. That silk scroll worth a small fortune? Paper could be produced from trash for almost nothing. That clay tablet that needed a wagon. Paper weighed next to nothing at all, and could be folded, rolled, or bound into something you could actually call a book. For the first time in human history, a material existed that was cheap enough for ordinary people, light enough to move in bulk, and tough enough to last for generations. China had just solved a problem that had defeated every civilization before it. And for the next 600 years, China had absolutely no intention of telling anyone how. This is where the story stops feeling like a documentary and starts feeling like a heist film. Paper crept quietly into Korea, then Japan, through trade and shared culture. But past that, the wider world remained completely in the dark, and China wanted it that way. Paper wasn't just convenient, it was leverage. It let the empire run circles around any rival still drowning in bamboo, and knowledge, in the wrong hands, was a threat to that advantage. For 6 centuries, the greatest industrial secret on the planet stayed locked inside one civilization's borders. It didn't leak out through trade. It didn't leak out through diplomacy. It escaped through a battlefield nobody was thinking about paper on at all. In 751 AD, Chinese and Arab armies collided at the Battle of Talas, near the edge of what is now Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. Nobody swung a sword that day fighting over sheets of paper. This was about territory, about influence along the Silk Road, the ordinary bloody business of empires colliding. But when the fighting ended and the Abbasid forces marched their prisoners east towards Samarkand, several historical accounts describe something the victors almost certainly didn't realize the value of yet. Among the captives were Chinese craftsmen who knew exactly how to turn rags and bark into paper. Imagine being one of them. March for weeks across unfamiliar terrain, carrying inside your memory a process your homeland had guarded for 600 years. A secret entire dynasties had killed to protect, about to be handed over simply because you were standing in the wrong place when an empire lost a battle. Once those craftsmen reached Samarkand, the secrets simply walked out the door. Within decades, paper mills were running in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Cairo, and the Islamic world didn't just copy what they'd learned. They improved it, experimenting with linen rags until they produced a sheet whiter and smoother than anything China had ever made. From there, paper crossed into Muslim Spain, and by the 1100s, watermills in cities like Sativa were producing it on European soil for the very first time. You'd think Europe would have grabbed it immediately. It didn't. The Catholic Church had entire industries built around parchment and was in no hurry to abandon it. For a long stretch, paper sat there, patiently, waiting for Europe to catch up to its own advantage. China had already changed history. The rest of the world simply hadn't noticed yet. It would take one more invention to make that advantage impossible to ignore. In the 1440s, in the German city of Mainz, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was quietly perfecting a press with movable metal type. Picture the print shop, the metallic smell of hot lead type, the creak of the wooden press frame, ink rolled wet across a tray, and then the sound of the press coming down onto a fresh page. Printing presses already existed before him. Movable type had even been tried in China centuries earlier. What made Gutenberg's version different was that he built it for a small alphabet, paired it with oil-based ink, and adapted a mechanical press borrowed from winemaking. It was fast, it was precise, and it needed a steady, cheap supply of something to print on. At a scale parchment could never have survived. Printing a single run of Bibles on animal skin would have required herds the size of small countries. Paper made it possible instead. Now, imagine a monk who has spent the better part of a year copying a single manuscript, letter by careful letter, walking past a print shop and watching 200 identical copies of that same book appear in a single afternoon. That is not an improvement. That is a different universe. Within 50 years of Gutenberg's press, European printers had produced more than 20 million books. Within another century, that number climbed into the hundreds of millions. Ideas that once took a lifetime to cross a continent now traveled in months. The Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Renaissance itself, all of it rode on the back of cheap, abundant paper. Paper had already given humanity a place to keep its memory. Gutenberg gave humanity a machine that could copy that memory 1,000 times over. Think about what that unlocked through a single life. A student in the 1500s, born into a family that could never have afforded a single handwritten manuscript, buys a printed textbook for the price of a few days' wages, and for the first time in his family's history, actually learns to read from something other than a church sermon. Multiply that student by millions, across a continent, over a century, and you start to see why universities expanded, why science accelerated once researchers could finally read each other's work instead of reinventing it from scratch, why merchants could move wealth on paper contracts instead of hauling physical gold across dangerous roads, why explorers could sail with maps printed accurately instead of copied by hand and slowly corrupted with every retelling. Historians have argued credibly that democracy itself would have struggled to take root without a public that could actually read the pamphlets arguing for it. One invention, one material, and a chain reaction that quietly built the modern world, one sheet at a time. But something even stranger was about to happen. The world was about to run out of garbage. By the 1800s, demand for paper had grown so far past anything Kai Lun could have imagined that Europe and America began running out of the rags they'd been feeding into their mills for centuries. There simply weren't enough worn-out shirts and old bedsheets left in the world. Newspapers rationed their own page counts. Governments began recycling old documents, shredding outdated paperwork back into pulp just to keep the presses fed. Some printers reportedly paid scavengers to walk the streets collecting used cloth, just to buy themselves another week of production. That should have been paper's ceiling. Instead, it became its next transformation. Chemists discovered they could break down wood into pulp using chemical treatment, essentially rediscovering what Kai Lun had done with tree bark 18 centuries earlier, except now at a scale no ancient workshop could have matched. Picture a 19th century paper mill, steam-driven rollers clattering, an endless white ribbon of paper rushing off the line, a factory worker watching more paper roll past him in a single minute than a medieval workshop could produce in a year. The price of paper collapsed. And when the price of something that important collapses, everything built on top of it opens up to everyone. Cheap wood pulp paper meant cheap newspapers, and cheap newspapers meant literacy could finally scale to entire populations instead of a privileged few. It meant textbooks for pennies instead of dollars, which meant public education for nations instead of aristocrats. It meant packaging, boxes, labels, wrapping, produced at a scale that quietly built the infrastructure for modern shipping and retail before anyone had a name for either. A few decades later, Napoleon's armies would march across Europe running on a logistics system stitched together almost entirely out of paper requisitions, paper maps, and paper orders relayed faster than any single messenger could carry by memory. Paper didn't just survive the Industrial Revolution, it quietly powered a huge share of it. By the 20th century, paper had folded itself so completely into daily life that people stopped noticing it was even there, which sets up the twist almost nobody saw coming. Shouldn't computers have killed it? In the 1970s and 80s, futurists confidently predicted the paperless office within a generation. Digital storage would make physical paper obsolete, they said, the same way paper had once made bamboo obsolete. Here's the part that should stop you. Global paper and cardboard production didn't shrink after the personal computer, the internet, and the smartphone arrived. It kept climbing. The paperless office didn't just fail to happen. In several categories, paper use went up. Why? Walk into a legal office today and contracts still demand a physical ink signature, because entire legal systems were built on the assumption that paper can't be silently rewritten the way a digital file sometimes can. Walk into a bank and you'll find paper currency, the great-grandchild of paper money. China invented centuries before. Europe would even accept the concept, still circulating in the trillions of dollars worldwide. Walk into a hospital and prescriptions, consent forms and patient charts are still printed because the cost of a single server failure in the wrong moment is a price nobody in medicine is willing to risk. And then there's the twist inside the twist. E-commerce, the very technology that was supposed to finally kill paper for good, turned out to be one of its biggest customers. Every box left on your doorstep, every padded mailer, every crumpled sheet of packing paper cushioning something fragile inside, comes from the same basic invention China built out of old fishing nets 2,000 years ago. Global cardboard and paper packaging is now worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and it keeps growing because of the digital economy, not despite it. Paper found its way into places nobody in the Han Dynasty could have predicted. It became money centuries before the rest of the world dared trust the idea. It became identity, the birth certificate and the passport that quite literally define who you are to every government on the planet. It became art, folded into origami, pressed into fine stationery, bound into the pages of a novel that people still choose to hold in their hands instead of scrolling past. And in one of history's stranger footnotes, one of paper's youngest jobs, toilet paper, first mass-produced only in the late 1800s, has quietly become one of the most universally demanded paper products alive today. A civilization-altering invention, and one of its biggest modern uses, is something no official in ancient China could have possibly imagined defending in a memo. Paper didn't disappear in the digital age. Like it always has, it simply evolved, rearranging itself around whatever humanity needed next. So return, for a moment, to the question this story started with. How did one thin sheet of plant fiber become the foundation of nearly every civilization on Earth? It didn't win because it was flashy, or sacred, or expensive. It won for almost the opposite reason. It was humble enough to be cheap, light enough to travel, and durable enough to last, succeeding precisely where stone, bone, clay, papyrus, bamboo, silk, and parchment had each quietly failed in their own way. Without it, there's a real argument the Renaissance never fully happens, because ideas can't build on each other fast enough. There's a real argument the scientific revolution stalls out, because no one can share a discovery faster than a rumor travels. Global trade slows to the pace of memory. Education stays a privilege instead of a right. Government keeps no reliable record of its own promises. Civilizations build monuments to remember themselves, pyramids, cathedrals, palaces carved to outlast their builders by thousands of years. But stone only tells you that something happened. It rarely tells you why, or how, or what the people who raised it actually believed while they were doing it. Paper is what survived to answer that. The bamboo strips, the clay tablets, the old fishing nets pulped into something new, all of it led here. Long after the people who wrote on it were gone, long after the empires that depended on it collapsed, the sheets remained, thin, fragile, somehow still holding everything. Paper was never important because it was paper. It's important because it became humanity's memory. Every civilization leaves monuments behind. But paper is what preserved the ideas that built them in the first place. If this changed how you'll look at the next piece of paper you throw away, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind the things we never think twice about. There's a lot more coming. More